Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we are looking at 10 killers that were murdered in prison. Let's get into it. Cold-blooded killers who are caught for their evil deeds are sentenced in a court of law. Once they have been handed their sentence, they will most likely spend the rest of their days behind bars. However, some individuals, who are also in the prison system, believe a different kind of justice should be served and are willing to take matters into their own hands. This breeding ground for hostility alongside these following cold-blooded killers entering prison with a lot of notoriety turned them into sitting ducks. 10. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer became known as the Milwaukee Cannibal when the partial remains of his victims, including a severed head in the fridge, were discovered in his apartment. He murdered, dismembered, and cannibalized 17 victims between 1978 to 1991. Dahmer was finally caught when an intended victim managed to escape from the building and alert the police. Sentenced to life behind bars, Dahmer's sick and twisted sense of humor didn't make him any friends at Wisconsin's Columbia Correctional Institution. Dahmer was known to play with his food, sculpting his dinner to look like severed limbs and using ketchup as blood. Fellow inmate Christopher Scarver recalled, "Some people who are in prison are repentant, but he was not one of them." On November 28, 1994, Scarver finally had enough. When he was left on his own with Dahmer in a gymnasium, he beat the cannibal killer to death with a 20-inch metal bar from a piece of gym equipment. Scarver said, "He started looking for the door pretty quick. I blocked him. He ended up dead. I put his head down." Dahmer died from his injuries on the way to the hospital. He was 32 years old. 9. James Whitey Bulger. Boston's most notorious crime boss and murderer James Whitey Bulger was killed behind bars on October 30, 2018. Whitey had many enemies as he was a known informant for the FBI. He was serving a sentence for his involvement in 11 murders when he was transferred from the Federal Transfer Center in Oklahoma to Hazleton, West Virginia. Less than 12 hours after the transfer, Whitey was killed. Whitey was 89 years old and wheelchair-bound when his two attackers wheeled him into a blind spot on the surveillance cameras and beat him to death with a padlock stuffed inside a sock. The beating was so severe it displaced his eyeballs, and prison officials said he was unrecognizable. One of the main suspects behind the murder was former mafia hitman Focio's Freddie Hayes, who was serving a life sentence for the slaying of the Genovese crime family boss in 2003. 8. Leroy Martin. Leroy Martin, also known as the Gaffney Strangler, was an American serial killer active in the late 1960s. By day, Martin was a married family man and father to 3 sons. At night, he stalked women and teenage girls along secluded roads and forced them into his car before strangling and killing them. He also engaged in necrophilia with the bodies of the 4 victims that were dumped in wooded areas. Behind bars, he was stabbed to death by a fellow inmate, Kenneth Rumsey, at Central Correctional Institution, South Carolina, in 1972. Rumsey later hanged himself in his own cell. 7. Gerard John Schaefer. Murderer Gerard John Schaefer was a former deputy sheriff in Martin County, Florida. In 1972, he abducted 2 teenage girls and took them to a remote forest where he threatened to kill them or sell them as sex slaves. When he was called away on his police radio, the girls managed to escape. Then on December 3, 1995, Schaefer was stabbed to death in his cell by fellow inmate Vincent Rivera, who had no apparent motive. Schaefer received a further 53 years, added to his life sentence he was already serving for double murder. 6. Charles Schmid. Serial child killer Charles Schmid was sinisterly known as the Pied Piper of Tucson. Since his early 20s, Schmid was known for hanging out with a much younger crowd and also for dating underage girls. He would lure in the girls with his fast cars and then groom them for sex. Schmid met his end at the hands of 2 other inmates on March 10, 1975, at Arizona State Prison. The inmates stabbed him a total 47 times, and after losing an eye and kidney function, he later died from his injuries. 5. Richard Loeb. Richard Loeb and his partner, Nathan Leopold, murdered 14-year-old Bobby Franks in 1924. Loeb was born into wealth as the son of a senior executive at Sears, but he eventually turned to shoplifting, vandalism, and arson. Age 14, he met Leopold at the University of Chicago, and the 2 child prodigies became obsessed with committing the perfect crime. They were spared the death penalty, but Loeb soon faced another gruesome end. He was viciously beaten and killed by inmate James Day at Statesville Prison in Joliet, Illinois, who claimed the murderer had made sexual advances on him. Leopold, however, served 33 years in prison before he was paroled in 1958. 4. Thor Nis Christensen. In 1976 to 1977, serial killer Thor Nis Christensen targeted female students at the University of California in Santa Barbara. Christensen stole a pistol from a friend and became obsessed with a fantasy of shooting women then engaging in necrophilia, a fantasy he would eventually make a reality. His killing spree later earned him the nickname the Mad Dane. On March 30, 1981, Christensen died after being stabbed in the exercise yard at Folsom State Prison. The identity of his killer still remains unknown. 3. Donald Harvey. Donald Angel of Death, Harvey admitted to killing more than 80 hospital patients in his care, whilst he worked as an orderly in Ohio and Kentucky. Official reports state the victim count is more likely 40 to 57 patients. Harvey pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty and was sent to Toledo Correctional Institution in Toledo, Ohio. On March 30, 2017, Harvey was murdered by a fellow inmate, James Elliott. The Blade newspaper received letters from Elliott claiming he punched and stomped on Harvey in his cell. Elliott said he had grown up in Kentucky and knew the relatives of some victims killed by Harvey. 2. Leopold Dion. Canadian serial killer Leopold Dion raped 21 boys and killed 4 others after he was released early from prison. In 1940, Dion was sentenced to life in prison following a rape conviction. He was granted parole in 1956, but he then returned to prison after a conviction for raping a 15-year-old boy. Then in 1963, a parole board granted him release again, and he went on to kill 4 young boys. On November 17, 1972, Dion was stabbed to death by a fellow inmate named Norman Champagne. The inmate, who was known in the prison as Lawrence d'Arabie, Lawrence of Arabia, was later found not guilty of this crime by reason of insanity. 1. Albert DeSalvo. The Boston Strangler killed 13 female victims aged between 19 to 85. He broke into their homes and attacked them before strangling them to death, usually with their stockings. The Green Man broke into over 400 homes and sexually attacked over 300 women throughout Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire. He was always dressed in green when committing these crimes, which earned him this nickname. Despite no physical evidence linking him to the crimes, Albert DeSalvo confessed he was both the Boston Strangler and the Green Man. In 1967, he was sent to Walpole Maximum Security State Prison, now known as Massachusetts Correctional Institution, Cedar Junction, to serve his life sentence. After 6 years behind bars, DeSalvo was stabbed to death in his cell. So there you have it. What do you make of this list? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more content. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.